Ladies and gentlemen, we are live. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this PRISM web session. This series is a collaboration between PRISM and its mothership, the Institute for National Strategic Studies, and the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment. Today's session features Mr. Michael Brown, the Managing Director of the Defense Innovation Unit. But to begin, let me introduce the 17th President of National Defense University, Lieutenant General Michael Plane.
Well, thank you, Michael. I don't know how many speaker sessions we have that feature three Michaels consecutively, but this is one of them. Mr. Brown, thank you so much for joining us. I can't think of anybody better to come talk to us about innovation. It's a core of what we will do here at National Defense University, looking to improve ourselves and our institutions. So thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Lieutenant General Plane. It's great to have you here with us. Innovation is a buzzword used promiscuously and ambiguously, meaning many things to many people. In technology, it generally means finding a new thing or a new way to use something. Some innovations are disruptive and cause us to abandon things or processes that we've embraced in the past. After World War II and throughout the Cold War, the United States was in an innovation race with the Soviet Union, which ended as the Cold War ended. Today, we are again in a great innovation competition with adversaries new and old, but particularly with China, and the stakes have never been higher. As Russian President Putin said, whoever masters artificial intelligence will rule the world. President Xi of China says China will build a stable international order in which China's national rejuvenation could be fully achieved. And military innovation is one, if not his top priority. Meanwhile, the United States sometimes seems stuck in old ways, hostage to legacy platforms, anachronistic procedures, and political bickering. Michael Brown is the Managing Director of the Defense Innovation Unit, formerly DIU Experimental, based in Silicon Valley, and here today to share his insights from the cutting edge of the Defense Department's efforts in innovation. Prior to taking on this assignment, Mike was chairman and CEO of Quantum Corporation, chairman of EqualLogic, and CEO of Symantec Corporation, the global leader in cybersecurity and the world's 10th largest software company. His experience is much broader, but his bio is posted online, so in the interest of time, I'll pass over the rest and hand the mic over to Mike. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and Michael. For that introduction. I'm very excited to be here with you today talking about something that's really animated my professional life now for a couple of years, which is looking at the competition that we're in, the strategic competition, as President Biden called it in Munich recently, with China. I've recently co-authored a piece that Brookings published, which is this title, Preparing the U.S. for a Superpower Marathon with China. So this really will inform why innovation is so critical, why we need to be moving in a much bigger scale and faster than we are in the US today. So today's talk really organized in two pieces. One, we'll talk about China. What are they doing? What can we learn from that? And then second, we'll move into what does the Defense Innovation Unit do? As you can see here, we're celebrating our 5th anniversary since Ash Carter created us. And we're one of the tools in the toolkit that we have to offset some of the things that China is so expert at doing. So, and then of course we'll have time for questions. So, Nicole, if we can go on to the next slide. So I don't think a surprise to anyone on this call today that technology is really the key pivot point on which national power will be determined. This quote from the National Defense Strategy really talks about the fact that it's all about our agility in adopting technology. The U.S. has had technical dominance basically since World War II. We've set the standards. It's our companies on the world stage who are taking technology to world markets. But this is changing rapidly now with China's focus on technology as a national strategy. So what we have to adapt to is a world where we are not so far out in front that others can't catch up. In other words, it's unlikely we're going to see in the next 10, 20, or 30 years the type of offset that we've enjoyed since World War II, when, of course, the first offset was our asymmetric advantage in nuclear weapons. And the second offset, I think we would say, from the time of the first Gulf War, when we brought so much of, electronics to warfighting, everything from satellite situational awareness to laser-guided munitions, et cetera. So that era where we have the technology and our adversaries don't may be in the rearview mirror. So we now have to think about an era where, one, we're not leading. Two, the game-changing technologies are commercially developed. So the military may not be at the forefront of what are the key technologies we need from a defense standpoint. And that really means that we in the Defense Department have to go from being on the cutting edge, which we were, if you go back to the late 60s, early 70s, where Silicon Valley, where I'm speaking to you from, where that name comes from, where the semiconductor industry got its start. In those days, DoD was the first adopter. We were the lead investor in technology companies. That's changed. So now we have to figure out how to get access to these technologies as a fast follower rather than the leader. These are 8 of the modernization priorities of the Defense Department here on the slide. And if you take a quick scan, you'll see that only one is Defense Department led, hypersonics. There's not many commercial applications for hypersonics at this point. But if you look at the others, you can see they're all commercially led. And if you look at 5G, you see that's one where China is in the lead. And you could argue they're pretty close on many of the others. Eric Schmidt just testified yesterday at the Senate Armed Services Committee as they talked about how technologies are critical to our national defense. And he said China is very close to being where we are in AI. So they're at various levels on these different technologies, but we don't enjoy a commanding lead. And in one area, you could argue that the US is behind 5G. This is a very different landscape than we faced in recent years and calls for some different and more urgent action on our part. Next slide, Nicole. So as has been already outlined by this administration, we've moved from the era of great power competition, we're still in that, but where China is really the pacing threat. We've talked before about, 2 great powers, Russia and China. It's quite clear that China is the power that we need to watch. And that's really because of the strength of their economy. So we'll talk in the next slide about how we're competing with China across 4 different dimensions. These dimensions, economic, geopolitical, ideological, and military. In fact, you could argue that we're in a serious conflict today, really in 3 of those 4. The only one we're not in serious conflict is military. They're challenging us, and we're seeing clearly what their military capability is. They've invested in it like no one has in the last decade to try and equal our capability, especially in the Asia Pacific region. But we're already fighting in these other arenas. And China has recognized that the key to their economic continued growth is really technology. So they have a national strategy of transforming their economy to really make it more R&D intensive through a number of initiatives. One of the interesting things thinking about China relative to the US is we think about competing in different dimensions, some of which the government would take a lead in, some of which the private sector would. For China, that's all the same. They don't view a distinction across these different dimensions because they control that centrally. The Communist Party controls those different dimensions. Xi's quote here is basically saying they want to be the technology superpower by 2049. That means they're in the lead on those key technologies, game-changing technologies we talked about. They're setting the standards. Their companies are on the world stage with leading market share, et cetera. So they view what they've done in 5G just as the tip of the iceberg. They want to see that happen across the board in many technologies. And they're not being mysterious about it. You only have to read their own strategy to see where those industries are. And they've outlined that in a document that's pretty well known, Made in China 2025, but now less talked about as the trade war of the last few years made their strategy a little more broadly aware by more people. So now that you don't see them talking about it, but you can bet that they're still trying to implement those strategies there. That basically is the the biggest import substitution plan we've probably ever seen. You might know in the area like semiconductors, they import more in semiconductor value on their way to being the world's largest electronics exporter than when they import more in semiconductor value than they do in oil. So that's just an example of how important technology is for their economy. They've been very good at acquiring technology from outside China. That's been true since the Deng Xiaoping era, where they famously said, we are now going out to bring technology in. And of course, we know that that just doesn't extend to legal means. They're very good at industrial espionage and cyber theft on a scale that makes other countries' efforts in those areas pale. Their aim, though, is not to be stealing. It's to build the broadest technology base in the world so they can foster their own innovation. And they're already doing this in a number of areas. So if when I came to this work 4 or 5 years ago, I wondered, are they still just copying technology from other countries? That probably was not true then. It's certainly not true now. They are innovating in a number of areas. 5G would be one. Quantum communications, they launched the Messiah satellite in 2016 that uses quantum science for communication. And of course, they're masters at doing what the US did with the Manhattan Project and the space program. They get government, business, and academia working together. That's a little bit easier when you can dictate that that's going to be how we're going to proceed. But they've learned those lessons of what the power of pulling those three sectors of the economy together are. And in doing so, then they set the stage for national champions. So their industrial policy is very different from the Soviet-style 5-year planning, and they've really made it work because they've incorporated market incentives. So in these key areas, the strategic industries, they have in mind national champions. Baidu is that champion for AI, so named. Obviously, Huawei is for 5G. And the role of a national champion after getting tremendous support from the government and sometimes sheltered by China until they're ready to compete on the world stage. Think about what the Great Firewall does for them in that space. Then the company goes out on the world stage and they're meant to capture global market share using standards that they now set. And they've really moved from an era where they're just trying to compete on the world stage to now where they're trying to set standards. The successor to Made in China 2025 is China Standards 2035. So they really see that world-class countries and companies are setting the technology standards that then make it easier for their own companies to go out and compete. Technology has an even bigger role in their society than ours because they use technology and media for extreme control of the population. We're all familiar with the horrible things that are being done to the Uyghurs. They're using the same level of political and societal control without some of the ugly effects of putting people in camps on the streets of Shanghai and Beijing, where they're leading the US in facial recognition technology so that they can understand to a large extent what everyone in society is doing, saying, and speaking about on a daily basis in real time. And then they have a strategy that's called civil military fusion. And the basic idea there is any commercial innovation that occurs is immediately transferred to the military for its use. So unlike our society where we have something like Defense Innovation Unit that is trying to pull technology from where it's being developed so the military has access to it, they are trying to force that by fiat. And there's been different perspectives in terms of how successful they are with that, but there's no question that that's their strategy. Okay, if we go to the next slide, we really talk a little bit more in depth about these different dimensions. Again, these are the US way of looking at this problem. We already talked a bit about the economic competition, and this is where the competition with China is the most fierce. And it's a different way of thinking about an adversary than what we faced with the Soviet Union, which of course followed a military approach. It was more military and political. This competition is really about our economies and how technology transforms the economy. So it's not my view that China has the same philosophy that the Soviet Union did about political domination and wanting to take over the world. They really want to own the world from an economic standpoint. So vast subsidies of land and capital for key companies. They do things with technology that helps their companies from a standards perspective. We just talked about that. They like to own global standards. They now have leading positions on things like the International Telecommunications Union and have designs on being a much stronger participant on world standards. They've entered the WTO in the early 90s, but now abuse it because the WTO can't keep up with the abuses that they engage in. So they're really trying to use all the instruments of economic power, including Belt and Road, which we'll get to next, which really you could think about as a form of economic colonialism. They really want to expand their own economy by having more control of what's happening in other countries' economies. And they do that by offering development projects in many countries in Asia, Africa, and even some in Europe, like Greece, which find themselves on some hard times. And the implicit bargain is this isn't charity. They will loan the money, and if you can't pay it back, there's consequences. But the idea is they will provide that upfront capital. Their companies will put these infrastructure projects in place, and in turn, they basically start to control a big proportion of those other countries' economies, which benefits China. So the method here, if you can't pay up, is economic coercion, and we've seen this apply politically. They own a big proportion of a Greece port called Piraeus, and that has forced Greece to take positions aligned with China in the European Union against their more traditional allies. Xi himself has said it's now time for Asia to be run by Asians, which the translation of that really is Asia to be run by China. They're not very egalitarian when it comes to letting other smaller countries in Asia have a say. Just think about what's happening with fishing rights in the South China Sea as an example of that. In the military dimension, they've dramatically increased their spending, as I mentioned before, but it's very interesting how they are increasing that spending. They basically want to neutralize our capability in the US, so they're investing in asymmetric capabilities. So think about, instead of building the same number of aircraft carriers that we have in the US, they invest in the anti-ship ballistic missiles to take those carriers out and use AI as a way to make those missiles even smarter. Same thing with our satellite-based communications command and control systems. Rather than put up the same number of satellites, although they're working on that too now, they invested in the capability to take down GPS, to make the U.S. a GPS-denied environment in terms if we face our conflict. And we already talked about civil military fusion. Maybe one of the under-recognized aspects of the competition is ideological. They really want to make the world safe for authoritarianism. Their existential threat is really their own people rising up against them. Take a look at a document you can Google called Document Number 9, which is a leaked document from the Communist Party. And what you see is they view the freedoms we enjoy, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, as existential threats. So they're much more worried about a French Revolution event. Think about their reaction to Tiananmen Square. They're much more worried about that than they are some kind of problem with a foreign power. And they're using their now expanded economy to influence how people thinking about China, the soft power, around the rest of the world. So they're very much engaged in an ideological competition with the US and other Western countries. Okay, next slide, Nicole. So one of the things I say is this is not a new Cold War. We talked about some of the differences before with the competition with the Soviet Union. And this from Secretary Mattis, we really, from the Shangri-La dialogues, we compete where we must, but we should also be cooperating where we can. I think the Biden administration clearly is taking a note here, not afraid to call out China, as Secretary Blinken has just done, talking about the Uyghur situation as being genocide. But there are areas where we can and should cooperate. Climate change, nuclear nonproliferation, among others. So what's different? Why isn't this a Cold War? So first, it is about economic scale and technology, creating that scale for China. Just to give you a feel, the Soviet Union at the peak of its power was probably 40 to 60% of the US economy. And we'll look in a minute at this dimension in more detail. By one measure, purchasing power parity, China is already larger than the US economy. So we've not faced in our lifetimes an adversary who has the economic scale and has the potential to have a larger economy than we do, which most economists believe will happen sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. The second key difference is, rather than being an isolated power, which the Soviet Union did, China has integrated to a tremendous degree with the rest of the world. China is the leading trading partner of hundreds of countries, and really is looking to use the global institutions to make their way of thinking mainstream. And just a couple of examples given here. WHO could have been there as well. And then we've already talked about civil military fusion. The Soviets weren't anywhere near as good at incorporating commercial innovation, and you could say that the Soviets really didn't have commercial innovation. They didn't produce anything in their economy that the rest of the world wanted, with the only exception of maybe vodka. Next slide. So here is a look at the economies of the US and China and how that's changed over the last 30 years, and maybe look at the next 20. This is a Financial Times chart that I borrowed. The dashed line in the middle is where parity is with the US. So you're looking at percentages on the vertical scale, how much bigger an economy is than the US. And of course that number is changing as the US economy is growing. But what you can see is China has not only gained, but is gaining, because their growth rate is much faster, a 5 to 6% growth rate per year. And of course, for many years, that was 10% plus. And the U.S., not normalizing for COVID here, would be in the range of 2%. So this picture's changed dramatically, and what you can see is they've already exceeded us in purchasing power parity, as I mentioned before. That happened in 2013, and they may cross that line where they're larger than the U.S. in dollar terms sometime before 2030, which is that blue line that you see. We're still higher in GDP than China is. So they have 4 times the population, which obviously helps them grow to be a larger economy with less productivity. Next slide. One thing I want to introduce on this picture of the relative economy sizes is the importance of technology. Technology really is a multiplier. So you can think about a measure of relative national security strength as how big your economy is relative to the US. Now, if I've got leading positions in technology, I actually can be a multiplier on that and further reduce any gap or extend the gain of my advantage relative to the US through technology. Next slide. So we talked a lot about China's investment in technology. They're spending over 100 billion just to equalize us in semiconductors. They've not been successful in that yet, so you're not going to see semiconductors yet on this slide. But I did want to give you a sense, which was shocking to me when I put this together, of where China is leading the US today. And it's a much bigger list than I would have thought. You can see hypersonics on there. We're now engaged in the Defense Department in a rapid series of programs to catch up. There's this quantum science-based communications satellite Messias, which was launched in 2016. They did more rocket launches than the US did last year in space. E-commerce, they naturally have an advantage there because they have more users for some of their companies, like the Alibaba Group, than we have in population. Facial recognition, we talked about. They're also making tremendous advancements in energy, in battery technology. You know, they have decided they want to be the world's leading supplier of electric vehicles. They're already fielding twice as many on the road as the US is, and they want to vertically integrate all the way back to lithium mines there, with a strategy of all those profit pools for industries that are in Made in China 2025, they really see as profit pools they want to take from Western companies. So if they're successful with Made in China 2025, they'll go from having, in semiconductors as an example, a market share that would be 15% worldwide to 70%. They wanted to get to 40% by 2020. They're not making that, and 70% by 2025. Whether they make it all the way to their goal or not, it's a tremendous import substitution. So they take those profits, revenues away from US and our allied countries to place in China. And of course, you can see the scary list of where China is challenging our lead. where Eric Schmidt says they're pretty close in AI after he co-led the National Security Commission on AI to these other areas. And we're not going to like the implications of this. So if we don't like what we're seeing with Huawei, and of course that has tremendous national security implications, not just do we lose out from having Western companies be leaders in global telecommunications infrastructure, but every Chinese company must answer to the Communist Party if that company is asked to provide data about anything that company might have access to. So if it's a conversation that is facilitated by Huawei equipment between world leaders, that's easily accessible by the Chinese government if they would like that. DJI is here. If you don't know them, Zhejiang Innovation, the world's leading supplier of small drones. Until recently, the U.S. Army was using this technology, but now the NDAA has prohibited this, and I'll talk about a DIU effort that's aimed at how do we thwart what's happening there. But DJI has probably a 75% global market share in small drones. And then maybe a company is not a household name, unlike Huawei in the U.S., the Beijing Genomics Institute, which is really trying to harvest big data for biotechnology. They actually have more data, genetic data on U.S. citizens than we have in the U.S. because they've had a very clever strategy of all of the companies that we use, 23andMe and others, that synthesize our genetic data or makeup. That data is often analyzed on Chinese-based lab equipment, and then the data is kept by China. Now, they have a law in China that ensures that's not reciprocal. No data about Chinese people from a genetic perspective can be transferred outside of China, but we don't have anything like that in the US, so they have more data on our population. And of course, it's very scary to think about what that could be used for in the future, either offensively or defensively. Next slide. One of the key areas we need to pay attention to that has led to our technology dominance in the past, which we're likely no longer to enjoy in the future, is federally funded R&D. So this is critical, and this chart first just of what we're looking at. The red line is total R&D, and you can see that coming down. If we went back to the 1960s, that was peaking at about 2% of GDP. Now it's at 0.7, half of which is spent on health-related technology, such as the National Institutes of Health. So the defense-related federally funded R&D has gone from around 2% to 0.35%. And why should we care? Well, we should care because it's federally funded R&D that tends to lead to the breakthrough innovations, which are uncertain, take very patient capital, and are of a scale that really the government has a bigger role to play, more likely a role to play than private capital. So think about the internet. Could a private company have developed that? Not as likely. Or GPS, that has had tremendous commercial implications, which probably weren't thought of when we put GPS up. But so many companies have really built business models based on the ubiquity of GPS and the internet. And you can see from the different technologies here and the original funding, how many of these critical technologies have come from government funding. Mario Mazzucato has written a book that talks about every technology in the iPhone really came from government first, and Apple did a fantastic job in integrating it. So without taking anything away from Apple, those technologies wouldn't have been available for them to put together without that government funded research. So we've enjoyed tremendous economic security and national security by the preeminence we've had in science and technology, and that starts with the federal government. This is a trend that's definitely headed in the wrong direction. Next slide. So our prescription, or my prescription, for how we should prepare the U.S. for this superpower marathon, which likely is to last decades, is more federally funded R&D, and then more credit for, or more tax incentives for the private sector to invest in R&D. Talent, back in the 1960s, we were on a path to graduate many more engineers because we needed them in the US. We need to be on that path again. We need to really think about the tools of government being brought together so that while we don't try and repeat or duplicate what China has, we're using these tools together in an integrated fashion. And we need to be doing that also with allies, a big push of the administration, of course. And then one we didn't really have time to talk about is we need a longer term focus on the private sector in capital markets and businesses. As a former Silicon Valley CEO, I can tell you that all the incentives and pressures you face are very short-term oriented. It's all about quarterly profits rather than long-term capabilities. And we really need to address that because China has a very long-term view here. And the emphasis on efficiency of capital is not going to help us in a 20, 30, or 40-year strategic competition with China. So let's shift gears now to talk about how the Defense Innovation Unit is one of the tools in this competition, but I think it was important here to kind of set the stage. If we go to the next slide, Nicole, for what's informing this competition. So DIU set up to accelerate commercial technology adoption by the military. Next slide. So this is what Ash Carter was looking at, and it's another reflection of what the trends we just looked at. In the 1960s, as I mentioned, when defense was leading the development of a lot of these technologies you see here in the blue box on the left, defense-related technology spending was more than one third of global R&D. And of course, most of R&D was happening in the US. Look at how that's changed in today's environment. So the defense-related is actually, we rounded up 3.6%, but defense and US combined is not even a third. So a lot more happening outside the US that we need to take advantage of through allies. And even in the US, most of what's happening is happening commercially, as we started off talking about with the first slide. And I put 5G in red here because that's where we clearly were not taking advantage of this soon enough to change the market dynamics, and China's leading here. It's not too late in these other areas, but we have to change how we're behaving. Next slide. And how we're behaving, it really is being a fast follower. On the left, you see the top R&D spending of the 5 largest tech companies and how that's an order of magnitude bigger than the top 5 defense primes. So if we want access to the best technology and what's happening in the latest in these commercially developed fields, obviously we need to tap into what's happening in tech. On the right, you can see how much bigger commercial R&D is than federal R&D. Next slide. So Defense Innovation Unit is meant to do a couple things. Be working at commercial speeds, so that means fast, and go across DoD. There's a number of service-specific innovation organizations like AFWorks now, NavalX, etc., Army Applications Lab. DIU's mission is really to go across DoD. We're a joint force, so we have folks from every branch of the service within, plus folks with commercial experience, which is what I would represent. And we're meant to take slow solutions across all of DoD. So we're trying to accelerate the adoption. Secretary Mattis gave us the charge of work on important problems. So what you can do to transform capabilities, not just work on projects for special forces. Not that those aren't very fun to work on. And then third, how do we strengthen the national security innovation base? In the appropriations bill that Congress just passed at the beginning of the year, we got funding for something we call National Security Innovation Capital. So important it's repeated twice on the slide. I'm just seeing that typo. This is really a catalyst for private sector investment in hardware. Our venture capital industry has moved almost exclusively to software, which is great for extending the comparative advantage the US enjoys in software. Love that. We need that in the military. But we also need hardware. And we've been less of an innovator in terms of new hardware companies. So this is meant to be a start in that effort. Next slide. So this is how these, we have 3 different units within Defense Innovation Unit. What we started with on the upper right, so this is working with non-traditional vendors, startups, but non-traditional can mean large companies like a Google or Microsoft who might not be doing as much business with DoD, although more these days than in the past, and giving revenue contracts for prototyping that's on their way to getting a production contract. Then the National Security Innovation Capital is really an idea to get new vendors started, which might be future vendors that Core DIU uses. And then we have another group, National Security Innovation Network, which sponsors the Hacking for Defense course, if you're familiar with that. It's a network of 40 universities and tying innovative ideas that we can apply from students at those universities to DoD, current DoD problems. Next slide. So these 3 work together to strengthen the national security innovation base. we're organized at DIU to bring these innovations to the military in these 6 areas. The 6th area, advanced energy materials, we just started that this past fiscal year. The other 5 have been around for a couple of years. And if you think about it, it's not surprising that we would be in these areas. These go all the way back to the first slide we looked at, some of the game-changing technologies that are being developed by the commercial sector. So it's here where DIU needs to be pulling from the best of the private sector, and we're actually located in the spaces where these companies live. So our offices, Silicon Valley, where I am, Boston, Austin, and the National Capital Region. Next slide. So basically the value proposition for DIU is here on this slide. We work with DoD partners. We don't set our own agenda in terms of what projects we work on. We actually scan the Defense Department to look for what are the most important problems, back to Secretary Mattis's charge, how can you work on things that are transformative? Then we prototype and scale those solutions. And prototype here doesn't mean early stage technology necessarily. It might be very mature technology that the commercial sector is using. But as we were joking about the age of Michael's laptop before this program began, sometimes we're behind in the military in terms of what we're asking our frontline warfighters to use. So very mature technology in the commercial sector sometimes doesn't get to us in DoD. So we're trying to accelerate that process and make that more of a factor. And we're all about how do we scale solutions that are prototype. We don't want to just be a fast prototyping organization. There's quite a lot of that activity in the Pentagon. That doesn't help warfighters. It only helps when we can scale those solutions and make them widely adopted. So for DoD, probably pretty clear, we're providing access to leading edge technology through a very competitive process and delivering that fast. So 12 months for software, 24 months for hardware, and we ought to be able to do that a lot cheaper. So very important in an era where we might face some declining budgets. We've got to make maximum use of every dollar. It's cheaper to use commercial technology than it is to do something custom. That's just common sense. And then for the companies, what we have to focus on is how do we make it less daunting to work for DoD? How can we work fast? Even when the answer for a company that's vying for business is a no, they don't mind that as long as we can get that to them quickly. And then we want to, through a process, make large DoD awards available to smaller companies. We've probably influenced about $1 to $2 billion of procurement, which coming from a startup at DIU is a record I'm proud of, but we also recognize it's a drop in the bucket. In the time frame, we would have influenced $1 to $2 billion of production value contracts. DoD would probably have spent $1 trillion. So we're well less than 1% of what DoD is procuring. I don't ever expect that number to be 50% because we're going to need some things that only defense primes can buy, but it certainly needs to be up more than 1%. The other thing that we offer technology companies is a chance to really refine their technology and work on really important problems. And if you're an engineer, or if you know engineers, you know that's a critical factor in their motivation. Not only how do we work on important problems, but how would I get something I invented scaled to a broad set of users? So that's another thing that we offer as a challenging, demanding customer for small companies. And unlike what you may have read about with Google and Project Maven, we're seeing no shortage of companies that want to work with DIU and DoD. We've probably seen proposals from 2,500 different companies, written contracts for over 200, and introduced 65 first-time vendors to DoD. Next slide. I think we're going to wrap up with an example of a project. We work on projects, so something that comes to us from a DoD partner, and this is a great example of something that we've done that directly hits the competition with China. We call it Blue SUAS, or Small Unmanned Aerial Systems, so small drones, and we wanted to create a viable alternative to DJI, which will take a number of years to do. DJI was that logo, 75% of the world market share of small drones. So what we needed to do is figure out how to standardize the product. The military, as you know, is famous for splintering its efforts, and every service wants their own flavor. So the idea was, how do we standardize the product offering? How can we even standardize that across the whole government? So the second part of our solution here was aggregating U.S. government buying power so that Department of Interior, Customs Border Patrol, other parts of the U.S. government who buy drones would have a cyber-hardened solution that we've proven in DoD, but able to still help a set of vendors that we've identified create a more economically viable base for their future. So you can see, to standardize the product, we work across DoD. This was a program of record with Army PEO Aviation, and the program of record was called Short Range Reconnaissance. But we leveraged that effort, which was really a bake-off among commercial vendors, to have other parts of the military follow that evaluation and then sign up to use the same drones. And then we worked with 6 different commercial vendors initially. These are the 5 that made it through that bake-off. 1 the Army will select, but all 5 we've put on the GSA schedule so that the rest of government could buy. And now we're in the process of working with state and local law enforcement, who also buys drones, so that they know about this as a set of viable sources. And with allied governments, how can we sell this to foreign militaries so they don't have to go through the same evaluation process and can leverage the work that we've done and support the vendors that we've chosen here, one of which is from an allied company. Parrot is a French company. So a great example here of a project that's trying to scale innovation quickly to the military, an Army program of record, but expanded across all of DoD, which is part of what DIU's mission is. And in this case, how can we really start to affect, even if it's on the margin, the competition with China by putting a dent in what DJI has done on the world stage with small drones. So it's a perfect example of the kind of thing that we were meant to do in setting up DIU, and it's a project that we're particularly proud of. This team has gone on now to recommend what should happen in the next phase, which is really that we have a more continuous refresh. So rather than wait for the next program of record that we can assist, we have a plan here to have a more continuous evaluation of drones as they come out in the market, because one of the issues here is commercial development cycles are happening at a much faster pace. We're going to see new drones come out every year. So how are we evaluating those on that basis, the commercial cycle rather than a military cycle, and getting those new drones available for DoD and the GSA schedule? So that's what's conceived in the next iteration of this more continuous evaluation. We'll be able to expand the number of drones we're looking at, those that can have a higher persistence rate, be in the air longer, those that can carry some small cargo. So we'll have a wider range of capability, but always refreshing with what is the current commercial technology, making that available to the military and now across government. I think that's our last slide, Nicole, if I'm not mistaken. And so I'd love to get in a conversation with you and address some of the questions that you have. So turn it back over to you, Michael.
Michael, are you there?
There we are.
There we go.
Thank you very much, Mike, for those insights. For the rest of the session, we'll move to the question and discussion format with the audience. So everyone in the room, please feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat by just clicking on the chat icon, which is 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 containing a question mark. Be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, unless you'd prefer to remain anonymous. And you may also vote on those questions that you would like addressed most by hitting the like button next to the question. Mike, there's one question that's already, we have quite a backlog, but there's one that's already arisen that reflects on a discussion that we had earlier, which I'd like to share with you from, let's see, yes, from Glenn Ayers. What's your opinion of some companies that are totally against working with the US government, such as Google with respect to the Maven project, and how is DIU helping to change the minds of these companies? I know you addressed that, but could you elaborate your response a little bit?
Absolutely. I think that we probably can do a better job within the military of explaining how broad the mission is at DoD. So people think of the military and immediately start thinking about, war fighting. But those of us in the military know how broad this mission really is, including supporting COVID relief right now. So many of our medical personnel are helping with vaccination efforts. The U.S. military is first on the ground when there's an international disaster. We're helping countries rebuild. Same with here in the U.S. when the National Guard is deployed. So the U.S. military has a very wide mission set to help the American people and people around the world. So that's step one. I think we can do a better job of explaining how broad this mission is and why technology is important to help all those folks who are trying to help others. Second, military is no different from any other organization where we are deploying tools and we need to have the best. We were joking before about the aging laptops that some of us are using in DoD, but when we're talking about some of the tools that are used for very important missions, which could be, in Project Maven's case, how many bloodshot eyes there are looking at pixels, trying to understand what's happening in the rest of the world. There's no reason why we don't want those people with critical jobs to have the best tools. Why would we ask the folks in the military to use pencil and paper when supercomputers are available? So there's an important mission to ensure that the military has the best capability. Now, what the military does with that is a political decision and a civilian decision. So as has already been said, the real opportunity to exercise your political point of view is at the polls. And fortunately, we do that frequently in this country, something that China is not able to take advantage of. Their people do not have that freedom, that privilege. So I think we can do a better job of telling the story. I am pleased, as I indicated, that most companies get the importance of this, and that Project Maven and Google was really a highly publicized exception to the rule. So they're probably more veteran. I think I've heard some Google executives say there's more veterans at Google than there were people involved in those protests. They just weren't organized. So it'd be a mistake to think that Google was represented just by that very vocal group of folks who got together and said they didn't like what Project Maven was about. As we're seeing, there are no shortage of companies who want to work with DoD. So I think the most important perspective I have is that if we can show that there's a way to work with the DoD that doesn't work on kind of historically long, cumbersome timeframes, we'll have no shortage of folks who really want to work with us. So I'm very pleased by that. We saw the number of submissions to projects that we put out go up 100% year over year. So that's just an indication of there's a tremendous desire. We just got to make sure it's easy enough and more than, a fraction of a percent go out to those companies. Imagine if that was 5% of DoD's procurement, how much more attention we'd be getting, not just from people who want the business, but people who start to think about designing for DoD needs. Maybe just the last perspective is, I think the military has a very high, maybe the highest confidence rating from the American people. So of all institutions, much higher than the presidency or the Congress, the U.S. military is held in very high regard. And so I think this is an indication that while protests can be visible, most people still believe that the American military is a force for good in the world. And we're reinforcing that with the importance we're placing on ethical principles to be used when we deploy technology. I don't see anything in China or Russia that's advocating this. So we really want to ensure that businesses and the American people understand that this is how we think about using technology. Any technology could be used for good or for ill, but we're really thinking about how can we do this, deploy technology in a very responsible way. I'm very proud of how the military approaches this problem.
Thank you, Mike. It could be that the gap between Silicon Valley and the Washington national security community is not as wide as might be thought here in the Washington area. The next question is from Walt Hudson from the Eisenhower School. Is DIU part of a larger, deliberately networked set of innovation-oriented agencies and entities within the U.S. government, not just services, but federal government, such as SBIR? If not, would perhaps one way to understand the various innovation entities to do that in an association-like way?
So Walt, great to be with you again. I'm focusing on one word in your question, deliberate. So there are a number of, and this really goes to Michael's point in the beginning, innovation is a very overused term. So there's a number of innovation organizations that have sprouted, not conceived holistically, and we are not coordinated in a deliberate fashion. we could argue about whether that is a benefit or a disadvantage of how we're set up, because there's benefits of everybody working on their own mission and being smaller. But to a point that Eric Schmidt made in yesterday's Senate Armed Services Committee testimony, as a group, we're under-resourced and underutilized relative to the scale of what we're trying to change the Defense Department, and your point, broader across government. We are trying to take advantage of some of the tools that are available, like SBIRs, the different levels of adoption of SBIRs by the various innovation organizations. Most of what DIU has done is not based on SBIRs, which have some constraints, but we have more freedom to act, and it is based on R&D spending. I did just help organize a conference that we had last week, a government-only conference, which we called a DoD IC Innovation Sync, which was one attempt to pull together about 30 different innovation organizations, and there's more than that across the government, so that we could talk about what are the common challenges, what are our best practices that we can share, and what could we be doing together. It's pretty clear to all of us in this innovation ecosystem that more could be gained by working together. But at this point is relying upon us as a community, and we're committed to do this, to being together and seeing what we can do together, rather than that being something that is dictated to us. So it's not quite as deliberate, but I'm hoping that the energy we saw in terms of people that want to work together will be a very positive force for making sure that we can multiply our efforts.
Thank you, Mike. One question that arose last time you were with us on a panel about a month ago from Brian Greenwald at the Joint Force Staff College was, is there a map of the various innovation units around the Department of Defense and the federal government writ large? And if there isn't, shouldn't we develop one? And that's something I hope that you and others and we at National Defense University might seize as an initiative. The next question comes from Jim Krupe. Taiwan is a major player in semiconductor manufacturing, along with South Korea. Why doesn't the U.S. form strategic economic alliances around core supply chains like semiconductors in a kind of NATO-like contract, in addition to the military alliances it has with the Quad, Five Eyes countries, and part of the whole of nation approach to China?
Great question. I love that. I mean, absolutely, we need to be doing more with allies, and there's been a set of ideas. One that we've been proponents of, we call the Tech 12. There's also been other efforts, Tech 10. Richard Fontaine wrote an article on this recently in Foreign Affairs. The UK government's been instrumental with an initiative they call the D10 for democratic nations, top 10 getting together. So I think this idea is getting a lot of momentum right now. How could we as a set of allies, as democratic countries, get more from our technology development and collaboration than we do as individual nations? This is critical to overcoming the scale advantages that China enjoys relative to the US alone. If we approach this in a bilateral way, as we talked about with those economic graphs we looked at earlier, we're going to be a disadvantage in the next decade relative to China's scale. And you could argue in some spaces we're behind already, internet users as an example, adoption of digital currencies. But if we combine with allies, there's a much greater scale that is available. So we need to do that. There's various forums that are being described. We need to be playing offense in terms of setting technology standards as a group of Western countries or democratic countries. When I say Western here, I'm definitely including Australia, Japan, South Korea. And we need to make sure that the standards we're setting are friendly to our values as democracies. So we're missing out a lot if we're not playing there. So I think this idea is really catching on. I want to just spend a minute on your comment on Taiwan and TSMC in particular. There is a critical vulnerability that we face today in the competition with China, and that's semiconductor manufacturing. So because we've adopted a world is flat and we have no enemies approach since the end of the Cold War, we've let economics drive locations of where things are made. That works very well from an economic standpoint until you face large adversaries like China. So that's not looking quite as appealing in a world where we're in a strategic competition with China. And we have questions about for how long China, the Communist Party of China, will recognize the sovereignty of Taiwan. Politically, they don't recognize it at all, but when does that lead to other measures? So this is a critical supply chain vulnerability. About 50% of the advanced semiconductor capacity is with one company, TSMC, just as their name implies, in Taiwan. I think that's very dangerous, and we need other ideas. What you suggested, the CHIPS Act, of course, has been something that was in front of the Congress, but not funded. So nothing's been funded on that to get some of that capacity back to allied countries and expand beyond what's in South Korea. Some here back at home. So Intel and TSMC have both talked about creating some fab capacity in Arizona. I think whether you're talking about it US or allied, we need to make sure that that gets diversified outside of TSMC Taiwan. If we lost that 50% semiconductor capacity, whether it was through a natural disaster or something else, that would be a devastating blow to the US economy. It's hard to think about what that would mean if we didn't have access to the chip supply. You're already seeing a aberration in terms of auto production because they're not able to get the chips they need. Imagine if that were true for all the things we need in defense and across the economy. Defense is only 2 to 3% of the purchase of semiconductors. So defense isn't driving this, but we need this for our economic prosperity as a nation.
Mike, the next question is from my former colleague, Michael Mazar, now at RAND. Mike, great to have you here with us. Your fourth suggestion, enhance long-term focus of U.S. capital, seems tough, but central to our competitive challenge. Is the massive short-term bias of the current private equity shareholder model a competitive disadvantage? Seems like the bias is powerful enough that marginal incentives will only do so much. What can we do about this?
Well, Mike, great to be with you again as well. I'm a big admirer of your work over at RAND. I think this is, of the recommendations, the one that probably is the hardest, the heaviest lift for us, because we have a view, of course, that markets are supreme and we shouldn't interfere. But of course, our markets in the US, to make sure they're equitable, are regulated. So I think we need to think very carefully about what solutions we deploy, because we don't want to make sure the solution is worse than the problem. But absolutely agree with your premise that it is a disadvantage in a long-term strategic competition to be focused on the shortest term measures. So I'll just give you some examples of some things I think we could do. Number one, very positive step by the Business Roundtable to say that we really need to think the era of the shareholder revolution, which of course has been around since the 1980s and increasingly has driven us to efficiency of capital, which gets measured in very short-term ways and has led to the rise of investor groups that are focused short-term, like private equity and activists. So very pleased to say, they came out recently and said we really need to think of more stakeholder model, and the stakeholders here I think need to be expanded to what's in the national interest, not just what's important for communities that we serve. Second, the measures that we use. There's no broader, or there's no more highly visible measure for a company than quarterly earnings per share. Is that really the right measure? It's not, certainly not the only measure that we should be using. There should be some measure of R&D capability that we're developing. There ought to be a 10-year return on earnings rather than a 1 quarter, because if we use something that is quarterly, as you well know, we're going to come up with the wrong answer. We're going to continue to underinvest in R&D, not bring on capability for the future, not take risks with business, and continue to just cost cut and deliver higher EPS. And that's not in keeping with developing capabilities of the nation that we're going to need. So I think measures are important, and incentives. We've got to get the owners in our system on board with this. So today our owners are not invested in our company. You can see that in the very short-term holdings that institutional owners have in stocks. So this has gone from several years to now the average length that a institutional owner has stock is less than 1 year. How are you going to have a long-term interest in how that company is doing if your horizon is 9 months? If it's 9 years, you're going to think more about what is that company doing in R&D, what are the new markets it's entering, what are the fundamental capabilities, how strong is the engineering base, and those are the kind of questions we need to be addressing if we're serious about having our companies be preeminent on the world stage, not who increased their return on capital by a couple of points and delivered a few more pennies per share. That's not going to help us when we're facing an adversary like China. So there's so much that needs to be done here. I'm a bit daunted by the challenge, but if we don't coalesce around how important this is and get a broader range of people thinking about it, we're certainly never going to achieve what we need here. So I'm optimistic that if we put our heads together on this, we can come up with some solutions to basically ensure that the capitalist model that we enjoy is on the right track to develop long-term capability, profitability, and economic prosperity.
Mike, I'm going to share a question from a British colleague, Jim Maltby from the UK Ministry of Defence. I'm jumping the queue a bit so that he can get his question answered and get off to the pub in time. But the question is, it's almost a rhetorical question, the kind that could easily be dismissed, except for that it's very profound and it's a strategic question that we ought to be asking, in my opinion. He asks, why the focus on technology when McChrystal showed us in Team of Teams that technological sophistication is useless when you're outthought, and by organizational agility? Why not invest in thinking and organizational agility?
Yes, I think while technology is important because you want to have an equal playing field in terms of what your adversary has, and if you're technologically disadvantaged, we know that doesn't lead to a good outcome in a conflict situation. I mean, let's go back to guns, germs, and steel, where that point was made, very pointedly for long periods of history. But your point is equally valid, and that I think is what the National Defense Strategy quote that I used is really getting at. We've got to make sure we've got the access to the leading edge of technology, and the big change for the U.S. and other militaries is that is often coming from the commercial sector. But we need to also think about how are we organized in how do we apply technology in warfighting concepts. So this really speaks to our agility. If you spend any time with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, John Hyten, General Hyten is very focused on this. How can we move at faster speed? How can we adopt that agility? How do we get the technologies that we're seeing adapted into warfighting concepts? So I couldn't foot stomp your point more strongly. We need both. Access to the best technology, and then we've got to make sure that we can use that in a very agile way. The situations we're going to face in future conflicts are ones where the situation changes very dynamically, and we're going to need to be able to rapidly adapt to that and not have the adversary be working a faster OODA loop than we are to make sure that we prevail. So couldn't agree more with your point.
The next question is anonymous. How can the West compete in the global IT marketplace where our system separates private business and government, and the China model that uses the power of the entire government in supporting state-owned enterprise?
Well, I like our model much better than the Chinese model. I think the Chinese model has the advantage of thinking long-term. That's where I think we need to improve. They have the benefit of a very stable political situation and probably a much more agile process as it relates to budgeting than we have. So we need to think about how do we offset some of the disadvantages we have there. But that's why I'm advocating that this is really a marathon. We need to be thinking of a competition that lasts 20, 30, 40 years. We've done that. The Cold War actually was a marathon that probably lasted 70 years. So we can do that if we're recognize that that's the challenge we're up against, but we have to think about it and change some things about how we operate. So I don't think that the productivity and effectiveness of state-owned enterprise is proven by what China is doing, but they have proven the ability to muscle together tremendous resources that include stable budgets. And we can really take advantage of our system, the creativity, the benefit of many smaller organizations working on a common problem, if we make sure that the objectives we have in mind are long-term. So recognizing this as a competition, recognizing that we want to be preeminent in science and technology, that we want to adopt this technology quickly, then I'm happier with our model of not one monolithic state-owned enterprise helping us, but thousands of small businesses and larger tech businesses like the ones we talked about earlier today, Google, Microsoft, Amazon. We need their capability as well. And how can we have all of those companies helping us with the objective we have as the government to make sure that we are first in technology and ensuring that economic prosperity, which in turn means we have national security. I'm betting on that model. I think we can make that work for us and actually outcompete the Chinese.
Thank you, Mike. This next question from Carl Lallerstadt from the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise in Stockholm rounds back to the question of working with our allies. He asks, one slide illustrated the declining U.S. share of global R&D. If we look at global open societies, how does their share of global R&D look compared to China? If the U.S. could coordinate an effective global alliance, would that suffice to maintain a democratic technological edge over China?
It can if we're coordinated. So what we would see if we looked at the question that you're raising, of course, is that globally, China's share has increased as their economy has increased. I don't think our goal is to thwart China's rise. The Chinese propaganda from the Communist Party would say that that is a U.S. aim. I don't see that at all. It's not about China's rise. It's trying to make sure that the U.S. and our allies are not falling behind because we're asleep at the switch and not paying attention to how important investment in technology is for future economic prosperity. I think if we coordinate a strategy with our allies, and this may be different depending on what technology we're talking about. You might assemble a different, this was the idea behind a Tech 12 idea that Pavneet Singh and I have written about. This is a different set of 10 or 12 folks for AI than it might be for semiconductors. Nothing wrong with that. We organize so that we take advantage of each nation's strengths and understand what are we trying to achieve for the future and how can we collaborate there so we're not duplicating our efforts, and how do we make a bigger market for our technology products among each other so that we're strengthening those competitors rather than being seduced by whoever the Chinese national champion is for that technology, even if they're offering it at a lower price like Huawei is doing with 5G across Europe. So I think with coordinated action and with a common objective, we can compete just fine and outcompete China.
This question from Jeff Jordan begins, if tech is the new global battleground, what is the Defense Innovation Unit doing with regard to institutionalizing, codifying, and integrating the ethical use of technology in both the domestic and international communities? More pointedly, is there any appetite for developing an international treaty on the ethical use of technology?
Some great questions. So it probably would be handled outside the Defense Innovation Unit, but the Defense Department is taking a very active role there. So if we use the ethics principles for AI, those were developed by the Defense Innovation Board, kind of a sister organization that Ash Carter set up, most recently led by Eric Schmidt. And the idea was, let's use the best of academia and the business community to come up with ideas, crowdsourcing, if you want to think of it in that way, and then provide that as advice back to the secretary. In this case, that worked very well because those recommendations were pretty much adopted by the secretary and are now department policy. And now there's an ethicist that sits full-time on the staff of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, who's responsible for that. And there would be analogous efforts for other use of different technologies that go beyond AI elsewhere in the department. So what we would be doing at DIU is trying to make sure that we also are in line with those ethical principles. So the effort that we have underway is making sure that as we select vendors, how do we ensure that those principles are adopted? So we actually have a guide that we've developed inside at DIU so that as we evaluate vendors for projects, is part of what those companies are doing, adopting those principles so that we don't choose a vendor who's contrary to that. So pleased with the work that's happening there. But there's a much broader issue, obviously, than DIU. But we're excited the department takes this very seriously. Your point about international cooperation is a great one. My friend Eileen Donahoe, who leads at Stanford the Global Digital Policy Incubator, is very focused on these issues and has written about them. I think there is a role for the U.S. to play in this space. We need much more active participation, probably led by the State Department in this case, to really create the right forums globally to do that. Because I think this, as we increase use of these technologies, adoption increases, we're going to need to understand with some foresight what are these principles, and it spans the gamut. If you're talking about biotechnology, AI, autonomous systems, we need to be thinking about the standards in all of these areas and make sure that we're comfortable with the ethics involved. So I think there's much more that we can do on the international front, and would like to. I'm hopeful and expecting that the Biden administration is going to take a more active role in creating those forums.
Thank you, sir. That's an incredibly important and challenging question. And to everybody out there, I'd like to just draw attention to the article in PRISM by Professor Charles Pfaff from the Army War College in Carlisle, discussing exactly that, the ethical challenges to the use of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems. The next question from Jake is, what can DIU do to establish standards of information sharing across the joint force? DoD understands the importance of achieving JADC2 capability, but we will only get there if everybody's working off the same standards. How can DIU merge all of the current multi-domain tools that are being developed into fewer, more concentrated efforts?
Well, fantastic question. It's really aimed more to the DoD than I'd say to DIU. I think there's awareness among the joint staff now that this really needs to be a high priority. Again, I'll reference General Hyten. He's very focused on making sure that JADC2 is a joint concept. We've had different efforts by different services so far that are putting some of the building blocks of this together, but the momentum is clearly to make sure that this is a joint program, and data standards, to your question, is a critical part there. There is now a chief data officer in the office of the CIO, Dave Spirk, who's working to make sure that there are standards so that data can be shared. So more attention to this than there ever has been before, but it will never be more critical than in JADC2. So I think there's an increasing awareness of this. I think it's going to help us to have that at DIU, so we can use those standards as we think about bringing in vendors to help the commercial side of what can be implemented for JADC2. But this is a much bigger effort, obviously, than what's happening at DIU. Good news, the Pentagon is realizing that and moving out on it.
Thank you. The next question is from my colleague at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment, Todd Veazey. You touched briefly on the notion of technology standards and called out the explicit intent for the CCP to focus on standards dominance in the future. Would you expand on the importance of standards and whether we, the US and allies, where we stand in the standards competition with China?
Yes, this is an area that needs a lot more focus. So I think if we look historically, we haven't had to think about the US or in some cases an ally proposing a standard that we might use. I mean, that certainly has been the case in telecommunications for 3G, 4G, all the way up to 5G. We were calling those standards because we populated the standards committees and we had the technology that was out in front. So it was less of an issue. Now, if we go to 5G, all of a sudden it's become a big issue. One, China's taken a much more active role in populating standards committees. And unlike if we sent folks from different companies to a standards committee who would have a debate about what is the best technology, the Chinese on these committees vote as a block. And this has been documented already in one of the key decisions about 5G. All the Chinese voted as a bloc to really support Huawei regardless of whether they were coming from ZTE or whatever company they were representing. So they're very sophisticated about using the power of their system, which is all about central control, to make sure they get the outcome that in this case would very much favor technology that Huawei had already chosen or gone with. So we just have to be smart that this is happening around us, and then be able to invest by populating these standards committees and thinking about what really are the standards that are going to make it possible for, again, democracies, Western companies to compete and make sure we're not put on a disadvantaged playing field. If you lose the battle for standards, then that makes it much more difficult for our companies to be out competing. We end up playing catch up with a standard we didn't design and maybe one that our companies have not favored. And this may have much less to do with what is technologically the best solution, which might have been the approach that we would have taken with standards development in previous decades, than what favors the interests of the Chinese government or a Chinese company. So this is the game that's being played. We've got to wake up to it and figure out how do we move out. And that's take standards more seriously, populate those committees with folks. To many, we've not even taken the step of making sure we have people at these standards committees. And we've got to make sure we're leading, back to the research point, by having the technology developed and ready to move forward on these standards so we're not behind, because you're not going to lead these issues if you haven't developed the technology. So I think both of those elements are very important for us going forward.
And China has a governmental policy, an official policy articulated in their paper Standards 2035,
right,
to dominate the standards making business. So that is quite a challenge.
In fact, I'm just going to add, they have a view, I saw this written recently and thought it was right, that third-rate companies develop products. Second-rate companies really are leaders in industries, and first-rate companies develop standards, meaning they're the ones who've seen the importance of technology. They're out in front setting the standards and really setting the conditions, determining what the battle space looks like, if you want to use a military analogy, for how we're going to compete. So if you're letting your adversary dictate that, you're behind from the get-go. So it's just pretty interesting that that's how the Chinese are thinking about this problem.
The next question is from Nathaniel Allen from the Africa Center. Short of a loss in a major conflict, it's often quite difficult to get defense institutions to transform to a degree needed to effectively win future wars. What do you think will be the result if neither the US nor China radically change how they invest and operationalize for military purposes and emerging technologies? Will China pass the US as both a technological and a military power?
If we don't change how we are behaving with respect to investing in technology, here we're talking about going back to federally funded R&D, is a much bigger problem than just the US military. As we talked about in semiconductors, we're consuming 2 to 3% of the global share. So in many of these markets, global markets, consumers are driving the trend. So we're not big enough to affect the trends. To your question, yes, if we don't change that aspect, not about consumer versus military, but about investing in the technology early enough to make sure we're the ones who have something to say at a standards committee, because we've made preeminence in science a national priority, because we're investing the money to develop these technologies, then yes, we will be behind, because China has made that their strategy. They're putting money behind it. We already talked about the advantage they have is the political stability. We don't expect them to be changing that policy, and they're thinking about 2049. What company in the US is thinking that long term? Does our government think that long term? We all know we're on a much shorter time frame in terms of our thinking. So I'm very concerned about this. We know the steps that we need to take to prevent that from happening, but if we continue to not view this as a national priority and think that we don't need a national strategy to coalesce around ensuring we lead in technologies for the future, we will get behind. We won't enjoy the same level of economic prosperity as a country, and then as a result, our military will be behind, and we won't be the first-rate military that we are today. I'm very concerned about this.
Senator Tom Cotton just published a paper on competition with China called Beat China, in which he argues forcefully for pretty much a hermetic decoupling from the Chinese economy. What do you think of that idea?
Well, back to Secretary Mattis's point, I think we want to cooperate where we can. I don't think we want to make it a fait accompli that China is an enemy. They are a strategic competitor, as the president recently said. But there are areas where we're going to benefit from cooperating. Let's look at how different the situation would have been had China and the U.S. cooperated on the global pandemic. If we'd been out in front forecasting this, the technology exists for that today. If we'd not been covering it up in China's case, wish it would go away, but if we'd been working on this early and there were cooperative work that happened back in November of 2019, what kind of situation would be in the world relative to where we are today? So there's areas where cooperation makes a ton of sense. Human rights, where they probably won't agree with us, nuclear non-proliferation, climate change is a global problem. I don't think we can retreat to our own shores and solve some of these problems. They're bigger than the US. And we talked about today, even in the area of technology cooperation, we need allies. We need to make sure that we're working with others on a global stage. So I would say that rather than think about this as a decoupling problem, how do we think about isolating China where their behavior leads to bad outcomes? So I'd rather see the rest of the world cooperate. You could view that as a form of decoupling, I suppose. I think that's going to be the answer for us, rather than making this a US-China decoupling issue.
This question is from Alexandra Trani. You mentioned that most of the government-related funding was directed away from military endeavors. Do you have any ideas about how we as researchers can encourage government, or Congress, and private companies to allocate greater funding to military projects?
Well, to be clear, I said that the federally funded R&D has now been split. Some are national security aimed, some are health aimed. A big portion of the federally funded R&D budget goes to National Institutes of Health. It's about half and half, so it's not more than. The key point is we need more research, not how do we allocate the 0.7% of GDP, how do we get that 0.7 up so that we're spending more, again, in the interest of making sure we're preeminent in science and we're providing the underlying capability for technology development, a lot of which happens in the private sector. But it starts with government, as we talked about before. Government has the long-term thinking, the risk profile to invest in things that might be spectacularly successful or could flop. And when it's successful, it leads to a lot of economic prosperity. So there's some activity in the Congress now. There was bipartisan support for Endless Frontier Act that Chuck Schumer introduced. Senator Todd Young was a sponsor of that, so was Representative Mike Gallagher. I see that Senator Schumer made comments today about recrafting that for the current Congress. I think there makes a lot of sense for the community interested in innovation and technology to get active and get behind one of these bills that's aimed at delivering hundreds of billions more dollars to federal research. So I think there's more energy around this now. I think the awareness of where China is on some of these technologies, as was demonstrated in the SASC hearings yesterday that I referenced, I am optimistic that we're going to see some action on this front, and we need it.
The next question from David D, I think gets right at the heart of your organization, Mike. Isn't there an equal and opposite correlation between bureaucracy and innovation? For example, the DoD has grown in size and hierarchical bureaucracy. The ability to foster innovation, which arguably works better in a flatter organization, has decreased. If so, how do you counter bureaucratic sludge?
Great question. We could spend our whole time on just that. So I agree with your premise that innovation in large organizations is tough to sync up. The good news for Defense Innovation Unit is we're trying to bring innovation that's done in many different organizations and small ones, nimble ones, creative ones into DoD. So it's not reliant on us to change DoD in that larger sense. But I think our focus in the Defense Department needs to be much more on agility and speed. Again, I'll reference General Hyten's focus here. Imagine how different the department would look if every process we had a clock on it and we were measuring how long did it take us. That's not the incentive that DoD has had. So we have incentives to make sure we're watching every taxpayer dollar. Who could argue with that? To make sure that we're not spending money that Congress didn't intend. So there's control, a high degree of oversight. So I'm not saying those things aren't good things to focus on, but if we shift the balance away from compliance to speed, that probably also has to be coupled with transparency, which is possible given today's technology, I think we'd see a very different department. Folks in the military are creative. They're ready to change. They have to deal with change all the time. My view is we don't have the right incentives in place. That's a very complex question to deal with. How do we get what are the right incentives? How do we change them? I think there's speed and agility. That's what we need in the military for the next 20 or 30 years relative to what we have optimized around since the end of the Cold War. So I think if we have the right incentives in place, people are smart, they want to do the right thing, they're very mission focused. I've never met a group of folks that's not, that is more mission focused than the US military. So if we have the right incentives in place, I think the behaviors will follow. I think that's our challenge.
It looks like we're just about running out of time. Mike, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. This question is from Colin Agee. I'm sorry, no, wrong question. Is there a place, from Glenn Ayers, is there a place for large traditional contractors to be partners or mentors for the smaller companies you mentioned?
Absolutely. In fact, probably one of the misnomers or myths about DIU is that we're not working with large companies. So we're both working with large companies, multinationals that we talked about. Microsoft is a vendor for one of our prototype contracts. Google is for several, as well as working with defense primes. In fact, 10% of the contracts that we've done are with defense primes who perform the very important integration function of different exciting, innovative capabilities that small companies are bringing. One of the things that I've learned about working with the Department of Defense is the department does not like some assembly required. Don't give me a solution that's in 3 pieces. Give me something that is easy to adopt and scale. So to accommodate what the department wants there, we often work with a prime or a defense integrator who can put these pieces together and deliver the complete solution. And that's a better outcome for the military because it ensures that the technology is going to be adopted. So we continue to want to develop relationships with large companies that we call non-traditionals, as well as the defense primes as integrators.
Mike, thank you so much for these insights. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us and thank you for your excellent questions. That's all we have time for today. So I'd like to thank Mike Brown. Mike, your insights are invaluable as we try to meet these daunting challenges. So on behalf of PRISM, National Defense University, and the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment, please accept my thanks. This session will shortly be available with a transcript on the SMA NSI website and on the PRISM website. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in touch. This is Michael McLeod signing off.
Thank you very much.